You're listening to the North Parkway Podcast, weekly talks designed to help you take the next step in your spiritual journey. You can learn more about our church at northparkway.org. And if these talks are helpful to you, consider using the link in the description to give. Your financial support helps us continue to make great content. All right, well, that's enough intro. Let's get to today's talk. History is full of famous people who explored new things, discovered new things, walked on new things for the first time, maybe explained new things. When you think about famous explorers, what are a few names that come to mind? If you're here in the room, just shout them out. Magellan, Lewis and Clark. Who else? Marco Polo, right? If you've ever played in the pool, you know Marco Polo. All right. There are a bunch of those that come to mind. Christopher Columbus, Neil Armstrong. You have all of these different people who have explored cool things, who were the first man or woman to do something really spectacular. One name that's curiously missing from the room is Robert Falcon Scott. How many of you guys are like, oh, I forgot Robert Falcon Scott, right? Okay, like one, right? And we're not sure if he's being honest or if he's just like, somebody's got to raise their hand. If you had been living in the UK around the first decade of the 1900s, you definitely would have heard of this guy. He's a famous commander in the Royal British Navy and a famous explorer. And he set out in 1910 to do something that no one else had done before, and you probably would have heard of him, and he just might have been one of the names that was shouted out here today if he hadn't have been bogged down by one of life's most peculiar burdens. It's the same burden that some of you, unbeknownst to you, walked in with today or logged into today's video carrying. And today I want to expose that, and I want to show you how you can trade that for something life-giving. It's part of our series called Traveling Light. We talked earlier about the luggage here behind me, but Traveling Light is our summer series. It's based on a great book with the same title by Max Lucado. And if today's talk or this series of talks has been helpful to you, you can order that. If you're watching online, there's a link where you can order it on Amazon or your favorite bookstore. I think we have 1 or 2 copies left at the Connect Center. You could actually walk over and buy one at cost today. But we're so grateful for Max. And by the way, speaking of Connect Center, if you don't have a North Parkway t-shirt or hoodie, but you would like one, we have a few. We don't have all the sizes, but most sizes, we still have a few left. So you can actually still buy one at the end of service today as well. But Max pointed out something really interesting about our life. He said life is like a journey, and so many of us, we end up walking through it carrying things that you weren't designed to carry. Things like guilt, things like regret, things like Pastor Shad talked about last week, the burden of worry. And all of these things, they're mental and emotional burdens. They're not physical, but they make life difficult for you, and God has something better. He wants you to travel through this life, traveling light. And one of the things that you might find yourself with, and the thing that Robert Falcon Scott found himself with that bogged him down, was today's topic, the burden of hopelessness. See, hopelessness is a peculiar burden. It's not a normal one. You might have walked in here with it, and if you did, you probably didn't realize that you even had it, because it's not a particularly heavy burden to bear. In fact, the weird thing about hopelessness is not heavy at all. Many of the things that you carry through life, maybe the burden of self-reliance, it's heavy, man. Your knees are struggling as you're carrying this through. You're trudging through. You end up exhausted and you make slow progress. Hopelessness is weird because when you open it up, there's nothing inside at all. It's empty. And it's that emptiness inside, it's that hollow, it's that missing piece that makes hopelessness such a difficult burden to deal with. Because instead of being heavy and adding stuff to your plate and wearing you down, it's what's missing that kind of makes you want to stop and sit and just kind of wait until something gets better or until he calls you home. Hopelessness is not a burden because of what it adds. It's a burden because of what it subtracts. And I want you to write this in your notes. It subtracts hope, and hope is a powerful motivator. Hope is a powerful, powerful motivator in your life. Robert Falcon Scott, and I forgot to call out the picture. Danielle, can we go back and put his picture up on the screen here? Doesn't he look dashing with his medals and his, I wish they still did uniforms like that. It's very cool. It makes me think of Captain Crunch with the shoulder deals on there. Okay? He set out in 1910 to do something no one had ever done before. No human had ever set foot on the geographical South Pole. People had been exploring Antarctica, and this guy actually became famous because he was one of these leading expeditions to explore the frozen lands in Antarctica. If you've never looked into Antarctica, it's a fascinating place. It's 1.5 times the size of the United States, and it's covered in about a mile thick of ice in some layers. So 70% of the world's fresh water is frozen in ice on this huge continent. And no one had ever climbed the mountains of ice to get to the very middle of it to say, look, we did it and we know it's here. And in 1910, he set out and said, I'm going to be the first one to do it. And like every great journey, like every great tale, it started with lots of hope. He wrote this in his journal just before they set sail. He said, quote, I feel sure that we're as near perfection as experience can direct. Okay? All systems are go. He feels great. Everything is in order. He's like, guys, this is going to be a huge success. And hope is what gets a bunch of guys to join his journey to say, let's all go to the frozen middle of nowhere so we can put a flag there for our country. Hope is a powerful motivator. It makes me think of a really interesting experiment from the 1950s whenever PETA was not as big of a deal. I'm a psychology major. If you didn't know this, I studied psychology in college. And an experiment that comes to mind when I think about hope is one that Kurt Richter did in 1957. And what he did is he took 2 groups of mice and he put them both in a forced swim test. We have that picture for those in the room on the screen. It's a really, like, everybody say, aw, okay? It feels so bad. So the forced swim test goes like this. You put a mouse in this vial of water where they can't climb out, and you see how long they can tread water until they drown. And you clock it with a stopwatch, okay? True story. And he put 2 groups. Now, this is what's interesting, all right? The control group, he dropped in the water, and he waited until they ran out of energy and drowned, about 15 minutes treading water. The experimental group was in, and right as they started to go under, the researchers reached in and pulled them out and dried them off. Okay? They were rescued. And then they came back the next day, and they put those rescued mice back into the water. And here's what happened. Where the control mice, who had no concept of what was coming up next, drowned in 15 minutes, the test group mice kept chugging. 15 minutes later, they were still treading water. 3 hours later, they were still treading water. 24 hours later, they were still treading water and keeping their head above water. So the researchers said, well, why don't we kick this up a notch because PETA's not angry enough with us? And they added air jets into the bottom of this thing so that it was turbulent water. And still the mice kept treading water. Okay? Here's the amazing thing. The mice who had been rescued, who had a sense of hope, kept going for 3 days before they started to go under and they pulled them out. Imagine that. 15 minutes no hope, 3 days in turbulent water with hope. It's because hope is a powerful motivator. And just a little bit of hope is enough to keep you going when things look really bleak. Now, if you hear that, you're probably thinking what I would be thinking. If hope is so powerful, why doesn't everyone live every day high on hope? It's because of this, and write this down in your notes. Hope is risky. There we go. That was me. That was not Keith. We love you, Keith. Keith is doing a good job today. Hope is risky. Hope is a high-stakes bet. And the more hope you invest, the better it is when you win. How many are here today with the love of your life? I'm sitting next to them. Anybody? Nope. Oh, there you are. Okay. Mine's on the back row, but she's here. Okay, I'm here with the love of my life. Now, let me talk to those of you who are here with the love of your life. Okay. Think back to when the relationship was brand new. Think back, guys, to the first time that you thought, I'm going to ask that girl on a date. And there was hope inside because she might say yes or she might say no. And you asked, and I don't know, some of you guys, you may have had to ask a few times. Okay, sometimes it doesn't work the first try, but you're persistent, and persistence is valuable. Okay. Ladies, think about when you saw that the relationship was progressing, and every time he said, I thought we'd go for a nice dinner today, there's that little hope. Ooh, maybe. I better wear a nice outfit, right? I better get my post ready. I'm going to make sure that I've exfoliated my fingers so they're nice and soft for that ring to, okay? Hope. It's fun when you have big hopes and you win. There's no feeling in the world like that. It's wonderful. But you all know that hope doesn't always work that way. When you invest big hope and it doesn't go well, it's heartbreaking. Trust me, I'm a Dallas Cowboys fan. I know. Okay? I've spent the last 27 years investing hope because every season they do just enough, Brandy, to get your hopes up. They do just enough. And we can't all be Patriots fans who got like 5 in a row or something, right? And it's so deflating. And write this down in your notes. Here's the risk with hope. The higher the hope, the greater the crash if you fail. You invest a little hope, oh well. You put all of your hopes into this vacation that's the one to rule them all. And we're going to spend such a great time on the beach, and then there's a hurricane, and you have to stay in the hotel, and the kids are kicking each other in the shins, and the Wi-Fi doesn't work, and your dream vacation is ruined. It's terrible. So here's what happens, okay? We know this. We've experienced this. You've all had hopes that were unfulfilled. You learn to protect yourself by limiting the amount of hope you invest. If it looks like a bad investment, you're not going to invest very much hope in it. If it looks risky, you're not going to do much. And a low hope diet is kind of like riding a bicycle. Okay? Most of the time, slower is safer. I drove up to the top of Pikes Peak this last week while I was on vacation. I can tell you, I was going really slowly downhill through the fog and the cloud off of this mountain with no guardrails, right? Slower is safer. Well, on a bicycle, slower is safer up to a certain point. What happens if you're on a bike and you slow down and you slow down and you slow down and you go too slow? What happens if you go too slowly on a bike? You crash, right? That's kind of how it works with hope. We learn to protect our hearts because I don't want to get my hopes broken. I don't want to get my hopes up for something. And there's a reason why you have all heard someone you love say, don't get your hopes up, right? So we want to protect ourselves. But what happens is if you get too conservative with hope and you say, I don't ever want to be heartbroken again, I don't ever want to be let down again, if you go too low with hope, you lose hope and you end up carrying this empty box of hopelessness. And when hopelessness sets in one area of your life, it tends to affect all the areas of your life. And instead of moving forward and following God as he's leading you through life, you just kind of stop. You get stuck. I call it the paralysis of hopelessness. Anybody familiar with what that feels like to have the paralysis of hopelessness? It's like when mom says to clean your room. Anybody else? Come on, hands raised. Anybody else? Mom said to clean your room when you were a kid, and you stepped into that thing and you looked around and you're like, dude, I don't even know where to start. Anybody else? I don't even know where to start. And so you end up just sitting and working for an hour and a half on your cleaning playlist. Because if I have the right song, I'll know where to, right? It's the paralysis of hopelessness. Okay, anybody else remember in high school or college when you had that term paper that was due that you kept putting off, and it's due in the morning, and you've been working on 7 different revisions of the opening page, and it's like, I just keep reworking the beginning, I'm never going to get through this, and instead of going through it, you're just like, maybe I just go for more coffee. Maybe Walmart's still open. Okay? Paralysis of hopelessness. It gets you in all kinds of different ways. But it can become devastating to the progress in your life if you lose hope. And if you've ever felt that way, if you feel stuck that way now, I have good news, but it's a mixed bag, okay? The good news is, write this down in your notes, okay? God has hope for you if you choose it. If you're depleted on hope, if you've run out of hope, if you're too low and your hope level and your hope meter has bottomed out, the good news is God has hope for you, but it's only if you choose it. We've been following through Psalm 23 as we go through this series, looking at God leading you through life's journey like a shepherd leading his sheep. And in Psalm 23, 1 through 3, we see this little piece that if you're like me, and you grew up in church, you've probably read this a lot, and you just skimmed right over this verse. But there's something powerful here I don't want you to miss. The Bible says, the Lord is my shepherd, and in verse 3, he restores my soul. He restores my soul when I feel like I'm bottomed out. He refreshes me. Hope is a powerful motivator. And your shepherd knows that. And if you find yourself running out of hope and things were going well, and then you just kind of got hopeless and you're like, I don't even know what I'm doing. And you end up just taking a break. See, it's kind of fun. I don't know if you guys at home can see me, so I'm sorry. I'll be right back up, okay? I'm sitting. But if you find yourself sitting along life's journey, here's the good news. Your shepherd knows. He loves you. He understands you're human because he built you. He knows what motivates you. And he's not off in the next county before he turns around and says, well, where did Dan go? I don't know. We better go back and find him, right? He's, Connie, where'd she go? She's missed. No, he knows where you are, and he doesn't leave you behind. He always stops to restore your soul. But he does it with a hope that's built differently than the hope that the rest of the world measures. See, normally you look at hope like an investment. If this is a sound investment, I'll invest hope in it. If this looks sketchy, I maybe only invest a little. God's hope, write this down, is not based on circumstances. It's based on company. The hope doesn't come because things in your life get better. The hope comes because he's with you through the things in life. Hebrews 13, 5 and 6 is a wonderful promise. Maybe you know this already and you just need a refresher. The Bible says, for God has said, I will never leave you. I will never abandon you. Let us be bold then and say, the Lord is my helper, so I will not be afraid. See, what happens is when you realize that God is with you, it gives you the courage to say, whatever comes is going to be okay because he's still leading me. I'm still in the process of life's journey. And if he hasn't left, I'm still on the right path. I'm still following him. When God is with you, it doesn't make the hills that you're climbing less hilly. It doesn't just magically clear the path and make everything straight and easy. The path is still the path. But there's a reminder that the shepherd who sees everything and who's already in tomorrow, who wants what's good for you and has a beautiful future lined out for you, he's still with you every step of the path. And when that knowledge seeps down inside, when it's not just a song that says, you're never going to let me down, but it's deep in your soul, this conviction, you're never going to let me down, that causes hope to rise back up in you when it had run out. He restores your soul. But the second half of that point is that God has hope for you if you choose it. And hope is an investment, whether it's based on circumstances or based on your company. 14 different times in Psalms, hope is an action word. I put my hope in. I place my hope in this. I will hope in the Lord. It's a decision every time. Do you want to invest it or not? And it's a risk every time. Do I want to invest hope or not? And the real challenge that you face when you're dealing with hopelessness is to choose where you're going to draw your hope from. One more thing to write down in your notes. You have to choose where to draw your hope from. Because sometimes you look around and it's kind of like this meme. Do we have that, Danielle, we can put up on the screen? I saw this years ago and I loved it. And I'll describe that. Do we have the vultures? There we go, right? Like the motivational posters for those of you guys at home. It's a circle of vultures and it says hope. And the subscript says, may not be warranted at this point. Okay? Some of you have been at that spot in life. It's probably not wise to hope anymore. And maybe you've lost hope because the circumstances in your life are like the vultures circling around. And you're like, look, I'm no dummy. I know it's going to be bad. At least I can protect my heart by not getting my hopes up anymore that this is going to get better. Slower is safer until it's too slow, and then it crushes you. And without hope, you won't move forward in life. You'll be stuck. And there's so much more for you. I don't want you to get stuck. See, Robert Falcon Scott started his journey with hope, but things did not go according to plan. The plan was to sail a ship to the coast and then travel 800 miles. Think about this. Frozen wilderness. 800 miles across frozen mountains until he gets to the South Pole. Well, I know this is going to sound crazy because all of you guys, when you plan vacation, it goes exactly like you planned. Okay? Mine did not this last week, and his didn't either. And along the way, he ran into delays. His motorized vehicles broke down. He didn't have enough supplies. He ended up having to take more men. It's a fascinating story you can read about sometime. And by the time he got to the South Pole, he was 76 days behind schedule. Makes you feel better if you were a few minutes late to church. At least I wasn't 76 days late to the South Pole. Here's what happened. Robert Falcon Scott and the 4 brave guys that climbed to the center of the South Pole with him, the day before they reached it, they saw in the distance a flag flying. And it wasn't theirs. And they did all of that work, and they were beaten to the South Pole by a team from Norway by just 1 month, 33 days. All of human history, and they were 33 days late, and there was a tent there with the explorer there, and he had a note addressed to Sir Robert Falcon Scott, and he said, hey man, could you please deliver this to the King of Norway for me, saying that I got here first. Talk about getting your hopes crushed. It's a bad day, but here's what happens. When you lose hope, it takes the motivation out of you. This is what Robert Falcon Scott wrote in his journal that day. He said, quote, the worst has happened. All the daydreams must go. Great God, this is an awful place. I'm afraid the return journey is going to be dreadfully tiring and monotonous. It's very different from things are as good as they could possibly be. We're so excited to start. He lost hope, and as Dan comes back, when hope leaves the room, that motivation leaves and your progress slows. And his progress slowed. He had 800 miles to go back to the coast, having been beaten. And they were so demoralized that their pace started to slow. And one of the guys that was traveling with him started to get frostbite on his feet, and he kept falling and falling and falling and hitting his head on the ice. And one time he fell, and it was the last time, and he never got up. They had to bury their friend there at the bottom of one of the ice mountains. And they kept going, and they kept moving, and they kept pushing their way forward. And a couple of days later, another one of the guys started developing bad frostbite on his feet, on his hands. He got to the point where he couldn't walk, and so they had to carry him on a sled, and they had to drag him along with all of these soil samples and scientific observation things. And so they're dragging this guy on a sled, and things are looking bleak. And at that point, they were trying to get back to a supply depot. And he wrote this in his journal. He said, "We may find ourselves in safety at the next depot, but there's a horrid element of doubt. That risk of hope. It's that moment where you say, I want to believe things are getting better, but the evidence says no. And if the only thing in your decision engine is the circumstance around you, and the circumstance is bleak, you're not investing any hope at all." The next day or two after he wrote that, the guy who they were carrying on the sled turns to his captain in the middle of the night and says, "I need to step outside. I may be a few minutes." And he was never seen or heard from again. They're down to 3. They went about 5 miles the next day. They set up camp. There was a blizzard. They were in camp for 3 days, and they realized, I don't think we're going to get out of this, guys. Robert Falcon Scott wrote this 3 days after making camp in his journal. He said, quote, "Had we lived, I should have had a tale to tell of the hardihood, endurance, and courage of my companions, which would have stirred the heart of every Englishman. These rough notes and our dead bodies must tell the tale." Now this is interesting. He's not dead yet. I'm not dead yet. Right? Somebody had to break the tension. Okay. Coming back. He's not dead yet. But when hope is gone, he might as well be. And Robert Falcon Scott, the famous explorer, and the 2 men that were left laid in that tent for 6 more days until they slowly starved and froze to death. And that's the entry in the history book for that guy. Now let me share the most tragic part of his story, because I think it's what makes it so gripping to me. 8 months later, realizing that something had gone terribly wrong, a rescue party was sent to the Antarctic to find what was left of Robert Falcon Scott and his expedition. And they found him. And do you know what they found? Where he pitched that tent and stayed for 9 days, he was only 11 miles from the depot. With all the food and supplies that he would have needed to make the rest of the trip back home. He stopped, folks. He was traveling 5 miles a day. He stopped 2 days' journey short of being saved. And for 9 days, he laid there and said, there's no hope anymore. Nothing will get better. And after traveling 1,400 miles across frozen mountains, he gave up 11 miles from rescue. Hope is a powerful motivator, but it's devastating when you run out. And God knows that hope is a motivator, but the enemy of your soul, he also knows that hope is a motivator for you. And make no mistake about it, there is a strategy from hell engineered to draw the hope out of your life so that you get bogged down on your journey, so that you don't have the courage to keep going on. And there are times when things will look bleak, and in that moment, it's hard to choose hope. It goes against every bit of your experience because the circumstances say, this situation is not getting better. Why would I have any hope at all? But God's hope isn't built on circumstances. It's built on the company around you. And I know that for some of you, and we talked about a few things earlier, but I know that for some, hopelessness is not a funny subject at all. Maybe you've been bogged down with addiction and you've tried, you don't want to be stuck in that thing. You don't know how many times I tried to stop smoking this, how many times I tried to stop drinking this, how many times I tried to stop watching this. I've tried all the stuff, it's never going to work. I'm just an addict. It's hopelessness. You don't know how many times I've tried to get ahead. No matter what I do, no matter how many certifications I get for work, they always pick somebody else. No matter what I do, I can never get ahead. I can never get the good job. I can never care for my family enough. You don't know. You don't understand, Pastor Chris. The doctor said there is no hope. It's only going to get worse. There's nothing that's going to get better about this. You don't understand. I've tried all the anxiety medication, and no matter what I take in the middle of the night, I still feel like I can't get up and move. My breath is taken away. It's not going to get better, and I understand. The circumstances, they might not. And the piece that's not popular in church is the truth. God being with you doesn't mean that everything's going to work out the way that you hope. It might not get better. But here's what I know. Here's a check that you can take to the bank 100 times out of 100, and you can count on this to be true. Jesus said in Matthew 28:20, "Be sure of this. I am with you always, even to the end of the age." And if he said, I want you to be sure of one thing, I am always with you, then that tells me that if there's still a pulse, then there's still a plan. God is not done with me yet. And if this one area of my life seems hopeless, that's not my whole life. And even if I'm close to the end, because listen, folks, some of you here, you're in the last leg of your journey. Some of you have lived a long time with the Lord, and you know, before long, He's going to call me home. But if you're still breathing, He's not done with you yet. If there's still a pulse, there's still a plan. And if you abort on that plan and say, nothing's going to get any better, you're missing out on something beautiful that He has for you. The world still needs you. Please don't give up. Your family still needs you. Well, I'm not any good to them. I'm just a boat anchor. No, you're not. They need you. This church family still needs you. God still has you on this planet for a reason. He still has a plan for your life. It's not over yet. Please don't give up. If you feel hopeless, don't be paralyzed. Allow the shepherd to restore your soul by reminding you that He is still with you. Hey, this is Pastor Chris again. Thanks for listening. If today's talk was helpful in your spiritual life, odds are there's someone you know who could benefit from it. Take a minute right now to share it with them. And if you live in the area, come try out a service in person, because church is more fun with friends. See you next time.